It was a sunny afternoon, and the royal palace stood majestic in the heart of the city, surrounded by busy streets and curious tourists. Among them was a young man, Michael, who had traveled from a distant country to experience the rich history and culture of this royal city. He had read about the royal guards stationed outside the palace, standing tall and motionless for hours, and he was excited to see them in person. For most people, the sight of a royal guard was a symbol of respect and discipline. But for Michael, this became an opportunity to show off his sense of humor. Michael had always been the life of the party, always looking for a laugh or a funny moment to make his friends giggle. As he strolled through the grand courtyard, he couldn't help but notice the stern faces of the guards. They were dressed in their impressive uniforms, standing perfectly still in their posts, their eyes locked ahead, unblinking. Michael thought to himself, how can anyone stand so still for so long? This has to be the perfect chance for a prank. His friends, a group of fellow tourists, were laughing and chatting nearby, unaware of what Michael was planning. He had come up with a ridiculous idea that he thought would make everyone laugh. A harmless joke, nothing more. He had just bought a steaming cup of coffee from a vendor, and as he walked past one of the royal guards, Michael got an idea. He quickly approached the guard, a grin spreading across his face, and without a second thought, he tossed the hot coffee right in the direction of the soldier's face. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The coffee splashed against the guard's uniform, and the hot liquid trickled down his chest. Michael, expecting to see the guard flinch or react in some way, burst into laughter, convinced that he had pulled off a clever stunt. His friends, startled by the sudden splash, turned to look, their faces full of surprise. They were unsure whether to laugh or to be concerned, but Michael's reaction made it seem like nothing out of the ordinary. The royal guard, however, did not flinch. He didn't blink or even move a muscle. He remained absolutely still, his face as stone-cold as ever. Michael, still laughing, looked at the guard's expression and found it strange. It was almost as if the man hadn't noticed what had just happened. For a brief moment, Michael felt proud of himself for pulling off the joke. The guard's lack of reaction almost made the prank feel like it wasn't worth it. Come on, it was just a joke, Michael thought. He's probably used to this stuff anyway. But as Michael looked around, he started to notice that not everyone was as amused. People in the crowd were starting to murmur and glance in his direction. The few tourists who had witnessed the scene began to look uneasy, and some even whispered to one another, likely wondering if Michael had gone too far. It dawned on him that perhaps the joke was not as harmless as he thought. However, he quickly dismissed the thought, thinking, it's just a royal guard. They're part of the tradition, but they have to take a joke, right? The guard remained still, but his eyes seemed to narrow slightly. Michael's friends, still unsure whether to laugh or not, exchanged nervous glances, and Michael, feeling a little uncomfortable now, decided it was best to walk away from the scene before anyone made a bigger deal out of it. I hope this version keeps the story interesting and engaging. Let me know if you need any adjustments or further expansion. As Michael turned to walk away from the scene, still chuckling to himself, he could sense that the mood had shifted. The crowd that had gathered near the palace gates had gone silent, and there was a strange tension in the air. Michael didn't think much of it at first. After all, what was the harm in a little harmless joke? But the more he looked around, the more he realized that not everyone shared his sense of humor. People were no longer smiling or laughing. Instead, they seemed to be watching him, their eyes filled with curiosity, and in some cases, disapproval. As Michael took a few steps away from the royal guard, his laughter began to die down. He had hoped for more of a playful response, maybe a quick reaction from the guard, or even a chuckle from the people around him. But instead, the guard stood absolutely still, as if nothing had happened. Michael thought he might have been disappointed by the lack of a reaction, but something in the guard's posture made him feel uneasy. It was as if the guard's stillness wasn't just part of his job. It was a sign of something much deeper, something Michael couldn't quite put his finger on. As Michael continued to walk, his footsteps growing more hesitant, he noticed that the guard's eyes were fixed on him now. There was no sudden outburst or angry shout, just an intense, almost piercing gaze that made Michael feel small. The guard hadn't spoken a word, but there was something in his stare that sent a chill down Michael's spine. It was the kind of look someone gives you when they've seen something they don't like but choose not to react outwardly. Michael tried to brush it off, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. At that moment, a few of the nearby tourists began to walk toward the group of palace guards, talking amongst themselves. Michael could overhear bits of their conversation as they commented on what had just happened. One woman whispered to her friend, "I can't believe he did that. Doesn't he know who those guards are?" Another man shook his head, adding, "It's disrespectful to treat them like that. They're here to protect us, not be part of a joke." Michael's stomach sank as he realized that his joke, which seemed so harmless at first, might have gone too far. It wasn't just the tourists who seemed upset. A few of the palace staff, standing nearby, began to exchange glances with one another. Their faces were serious, their eyes focused on Michael, who suddenly felt like he was the center of attention in a way he hadn't expected. The laughter he had hoped for was replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on longer than it should. Michael's mind raced as he considered his next move. Maybe I should just leave the area, he thought, before things escalate further. But as he turned to head for the exit, he caught sight of a few palace security guards moving quickly in his direction. They weren't running, but their pace was deliberate and serious, and it was clear that they were heading straight toward him. The weight of the situation finally hit him. He had crossed a line, one he didn't even realize existed until now. The royal guard, with his unblinking stare, wasn't just a soldier doing his duty. He was part of something much bigger, a symbol of respect, discipline, and tradition. And Michael had just poked fun at it. His lighthearted joke had turned into something far more serious than he ever imagined. The approaching security guards made it clear that things were about to change. Michael could feel his heart race, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how this story would end. I hope this version keeps the story engaging and interesting. Let me know if you'd like any changes or more details. The moment the security guard started moving toward him, Michael's heart began to pound. He had always considered himself a good-natured person, someone who loved to make people laugh. But now, standing in the middle of the royal palace courtyard, he realized that his harmless prank had quickly spiraled out of control. His lighthearted joke had attracted the attention of the very people who held power in this place, and suddenly, everything felt much more serious than he had ever expected. As the guards got closer, Michael's sense of humor began to fade. The smiling faces of the tourists were replaced by stern expressions, and the whispers around him grew louder. People weren't just looking at him now. They were staring, judging. He could feel the weight of their eyes on his back. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't just about a funny moment. This was about respect, culture, and tradition, and he had overstepped a boundary he hadn't even known existed. The security guards approached him with purposeful steps. They weren't rushing, but their movements were calm and deliberate, like people who were used to handling situations with authority. Michael tried to stand still, but his nerves made him fidget. He glanced over at his friends, who were now standing a few feet away, looking uncomfortable and unsure of what to do. They had been laughing at first, but now they were quiet, too, almost embarrassed by the scene unfolding before them. One of the guards, a tall man with a stern expression, stopped directly in front of Michael. His eyes met Michael's, but instead of the angry look Michael had expected, there was only a cold, unwavering gaze. The guard didn't speak at first, and Michael, unsure of what was happening, tried to offer a nervous smile, hoping that maybe the situation could still be smoothed over. "Hey, I didn't mean anything by it," Michael said quickly, his voice shaky. "Just a joke, you know." The guard didn't respond, but his silence felt heavier than any words could have been. Michael felt his throat dry up. He couldn't help but notice the way the people around them seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next move. The tension in the air was thick, and Michael's stomach churned with a growing sense of unease. Then, without saying a word, the guard gestured to another officer, who had been standing a little further back. This second officer walked over, his expression just as serious, and placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, gently but firmly. It wasn't a comforting touch. It felt more like a signal that Michael's joke was no longer a laughing matter. The two guards exchanged a look, and Michael, still trying to understand what was happening, felt the pressure mount. He knew at that moment that this was no longer something that could be brushed aside. A few more palace staff members began to gather, watching from a distance, as if waiting for confirmation that this incident would be dealt with appropriately. The royal guards, though silent, seemed to exude an air of authority that made it clear they weren't going to let this slide. Michael could feel himself growing smaller under their gaze, realizing that he had misjudged the situation completely. What seemed like an innocent prank to him was now a potential problem that he might not be able to fix so easily. At that point, Michael could no longer ignore the seriousness of what was happening. The crowd was no longer silent. It was whispering, murmuring, wondering what would happen next. His nerves were on edge as the reality of the situation sank in. He had never thought something as small as a spilled cup of coffee could lead to such a mess. Now, as the security guard stood close by, he felt the weight of his actions more than ever. This version aims to keep the story engaging while building the tension. Let me know if you'd like me to make any changes. As Michael stood there, trying to figure out what was going to happen next, his mind raced. What had I done? He thought, as his palms grew sweaty. The situation was beginning to feel more real, and the weight of it hit him like a ton of bricks. He had simply wanted to make a joke, to entertain his friends, but now, standing face to face with two royal guards and a growing crowd of onlookers, he realized that the stakes were much higher than he had ever imagined. The guard who had first reacted to the coffee still stood quietly, not moving a muscle. His silence seemed to say more than words ever could. Michael, who had once laughed at the idea of royal guards being anything more than just part of the tradition, suddenly understood the deeper respect people had for these soldiers. They weren't just men in fancy uniforms. They were symbols of the country's values, its history, and its dignity. And here he was, a tourist, making light of that tradition. The second guard, who had placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, spoke for the first time, his voice firm but not unkind. "Please come with us," he said, his tone not giving room for negotiation. Michael opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, and his mind couldn't process what was happening. Just a joke, he kept telling himself. This is ridiculous. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his joke wasn't as harmless as he had believed. His friends, who had been standing nearby, now seemed more nervous than ever. They exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. One of them, Sarah, finally stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "Maybe we should just leave. It was an accident, Michael, and I'm sure they'll understand," she suggested. But Michael knew that it wasn't that simple anymore. The royal guards weren't asking him to leave. They were asking him to follow them. They had made it clear that the situation was out of his hands now. As the guards guided him away from the crowd, Michael could feel the eyes of everyone on him. The whispers followed him like a storm, their voices rising and falling with each step he took. Some people were sympathetic, perhaps thinking that it was an honest mistake, but many others seemed to look at him with disapproval. Why did I think this was funny? He wondered, his chest tightening with regret. He had no idea how deeply he had offended the royal guards and how his actions had disrupted something sacred to the people around him. The walk to the palace security office felt like the longest of Michael's life. Each step seemed to stretch on forever, and the sounds of the bustling city faded into the background. All he could focus on was the fact that he had done something wrong. But what could he do now? The guards had made it clear that he was to go with them. He had no choice but to follow, his head spinning with thoughts of what might happen next. As they reached the security office, Michael felt his heart race. The situation had escalated so quickly, and now he was about to face the consequences of his impulsive actions. A part of him wanted to apologize, to explain that it was just a silly prank, but he knew that would be pointless. This wasn't just about the joke anymore. It was about the respect he had disregarded, and now he had to face that reality. He could only hope that somehow this could be resolved without further damage to himself or his reputation. I hope this version maintains the story's tension and keeps it engaging. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments. When Michael entered the security office, the reality of what he had done began to settle in like a heavy weight. The room was plain and functional, with a few chairs and a desk where an officer sat, typing away at a computer. Michael had expected some kind of confrontation, but there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the room itself was waiting for something. The officers who had escorted him inside didn't say a word, merely stepping aside to allow him to sit. He slowly made his way to the nearest chair and sat down, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. His mind was a blur, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the last few minutes. He had come to the royal palace expecting to have a fun day sightseeing, but now he was in a security office, unsure of what would happen next. How did this all go so wrong? He thought to himself. The joke seemed harmless at the time, but now, in the quiet of this room, it felt like the biggest mistake of his life. The officer at the desk looked up from his computer, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply observed Michael with a gaze that made him feel even more uncomfortable. "You've made quite a scene today, haven't you?" The officer said calmly, his voice not unkind but firm, like someone who had dealt with situations like this many times before. Michael opened his mouth, trying to find the right words, but all that came out was a nervous laugh. "I didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke. I didn't know it would cause all of this," he explained quickly, his voice wavering. The officer didn't react right away, but his eyes stayed focused on Michael, giving him the sense that he wasn't going to let him off the hook with a simple apology. The officer leaned back in his chair slightly, still studying Michael. "The problem isn't just that it was a joke," he said. "It's that you've disrespected the tradition and the honor of this institution. The royal guards are not just there for show. They represent the history, the values, and the dignity of this country. What you did was not just a prank. It was an insult to everything they stand for." Michael's face flushed as the words hit him harder than he had expected. He had never thought about the royal guards in such a way. To him, they had always been part of the scenery, people to laugh at, not figures of respect. But now that he was hearing it from someone who clearly understood the deeper meaning of the guard's presence, Michael's perspective began to shift. The weight of his actions was becoming clearer. The officer continued, his tone even but serious. "You will need to understand that not everything in this country is meant for casual amusement. Some things require a deeper respect, especially when it involves people who dedicate their lives to upholding the honor of the royal family. You can't simply treat them like objects of mockery." Michael felt his stomach churn as the officer's words sank in. He realized now how much trouble he had caused, and it wasn't just about the joke anymore. It was about the deeper cultural significance that he hadn't understood. He had no idea that a small prank could lead to such serious consequences. The room felt smaller now, and Michael wished he could disappear. He wanted to explain himself, to apologize, but he knew deep down that words might not be enough to fix what had already been done. After a long silence, the officer stood up and walked over to the door, nodding to the other guard who had accompanied Michael into the room. "We're going to have to keep you here for a little while," the officer said. "You will be processed for your actions. I suggest you think carefully about how you approach situations like this in the future." Michael nodded slowly, his heart sinking. He had no choice now but to wait, to face whatever consequences came his way. The door closed behind him, and he was left alone in the room, the gravity of the situation fully sinking in. He had learned a painful lesson today. Not all jokes were as harmless as they seemed, and some things in life demanded respect. Things he had never considered before. I hope this expansion keeps the story interesting and engaging. Let me know if you need any adjustments. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Michael sat alone in the small room, his thoughts racing. He could hear the sound of footsteps outside the door, the occasional murmur of voices, but inside, it was as if the world had stopped moving. The silence was suffocating, and with every passing moment, the reality of what he had done seemed to grow heavier on his shoulders. He had never felt so out of place, so completely alone in a situation he never imagined himself in. How did I get here? He kept asking himself, but no answer came. The minutes turned into an hour, and though the officer had said they were processing the situation, Michael had no idea what that meant. What would happen to him? Would he be let go with just a warning, or would there be more serious consequences for what he had done? He tried to calm himself, telling himself that it was just a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment of carelessness, of not understanding the importance of what he was doing. Outside the room, the situation was unfolding in ways Michael couldn't see. News of the incident had spread quickly, and soon it became the talk of the city. Tourists and locals alike were discussing what had happened. Some were outraged by the disrespect shown to the Royal Guard, while others were more sympathetic, thinking that maybe it was just a harmless prank gone wrong. But the one thing that was clear was that the incident had made an impact, and it was being talked about everywhere. Michael's face turned red as he imagined the headlines. Tourist disrespects Royal Guard, prank gone wrong. He had never thought that something so small could blow up into something so big. His friends, who had been with him, had tried to explain the situation to others, but it wasn't enough to change the growing sentiment. People were already taking sides, and the pressure of public opinion was starting to weigh on him. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was becoming the villain in a story he didn't mean to be part of. After a while, the door to the room finally opened, and the officer who had spoken to him earlier stepped in. Michael stood up quickly, almost feeling relieved that the waiting was over, but the officer's expression was still serious, showing no hint of sympathy. "We've talked to some of the witnesses, and the guard has made it clear that he was insulted," the officer said. "Your actions have caused more trouble than you realize. This isn't just a joke. It's an offense that could have more consequences than you expected." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but the officer held up a hand to stop him. "I know you didn't mean harm, but that doesn't change the fact that you disrespected something very important to the people here. The Royal Guard is a symbol of the country's strength and tradition, and you've insulted that symbol. The public has been talking about this incident, and we've had to consider how best to handle it." Michael's heart sank as the officer's words sunk in. He had never considered how much weight something as small as a joke could carry. To him, it had been nothing more than a harmless attempt to make people laugh. But now, it seemed like the consequences were much larger than he had ever imagined. The officer paused for a moment, as if considering how to proceed. "We'll be issuing a fine," he said finally, "but understand that this could have been much worse. You are fortunate that we don't take harsher action. However, this is a serious reminder of how important respect is in this country." Michael nodded, his throat dry as he processed the officer's words. It was hard to accept, but he understood. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the respect for the people who represented something far bigger than one individual joke. The officer turned to leave, but before the door closed behind him, he paused and said, "You've learned a valuable lesson today. Remember this the next time you think about disrespecting something or someone you don't fully understand." The door closed, and Michael was left alone again, feeling both relieved and regretful. The fine would be a painful reminder of his mistake, but it was nothing compared to the understanding he had gained. He had learned that what he saw as harmless humor could be something much more significant to someone else. And though the consequences weren't as severe as they could have been, They were enough to make Michael rethink how he approached not just pranks, but life in general. He had a long way to go before he could truly understand the weight of respect. I hope this version keeps the story engaging and maintains the tension. Let me know if you need further adjustments. The next morning, Michael woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. It was hard to believe everything that had happened the day before. It felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. He had never imagined that a simple prank could have such serious consequences. He had expected laughter, a few jokes, maybe a lighthearted scolding. Instead, he had spent the night in a holding cell, feeling more out of place than ever before. The news had spread quickly. As soon as he had been taken away by the guards, word got out, and soon the story was everywhere. Some news outlets had sensationalized it, making it sound as if he had intentionally attacked the royal guard. Others were more sympathetic, suggesting that Michael didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. The attention only made things worse, and Michael couldn't help but feel embarrassed. He never thought his harmless joke would turn into something so public. The thought of people talking about him like this made his stomach turn. When he was finally allowed to leave the holding cell, he was escorted by 2 officers to the courthouse. His feet felt heavy as he walked, and he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his chest. What would happen when he stood before the judge? Would they throw the book at him, or would they show him some leniency? Michael had no idea, but he knew that whatever happened, it would be a turning point in his life. As he entered the courtroom, he was struck by how serious the atmosphere felt. The air was thick with tension, and the low murmur of people in the gallery only added to his nerves. Michael took his seat, trying to steady his breathing. He had never been in a courtroom before, and everything about it seemed so formal and intimidating. The judge, sitting at the front, looked down at him with a stern expression. His robes seemed to make the entire room feel even more imposing. Michael's thoughts raced. What am I doing here? How did I get myself into this mess? The courtroom proceedings began, and the judge addressed the room. We are here today to address the incident involving the tourist who, yesterday, threw hot coffee at a member of the Royal Guard. The charge is one of disrespect to the nation's honor and its traditions, the judge said in a calm, steady voice. Michael's heart raced as the weight of the words sank in. He had not just disrespected the guard. He had disrespected an entire culture, a symbol of the country's history and pride. His joke, once so harmless in his mind, now seemed so foolish. He had no idea that something so small could carry so much weight. As the proceedings continued, Michael's mind wandered back to the day before. He remembered the guard's unblinking stare, the silence that had followed his prank, and how the whole scene had seemed to go from funny to serious so quickly. Now, in this courtroom, the seriousness of the situation was clearer than ever. This wasn't just about a joke. It was about something far more significant, something Michael had never considered. The judge turned to him then, and for the first time, Michael felt the full gravity of his actions. Do you understand the offense you have caused? The judge asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Michael nodded, swallowing hard. He had learned his lesson, but it had come at a high price. He tried to explain that it was a mistake, that he never intended to hurt anyone or offend the country's traditions. But the judge simply listened, his gaze unwavering. Finally, the judge spoke again. While your actions were certainly disrespectful, there is no indication that you intended malice. Therefore, we will impose a fine for your conduct. However, understand that this is a serious reminder of how one's actions can affect more than just themselves. The words felt like a relief, but also a weight. Michael had avoided jail time, but the fine was still a heavy burden. As he left the courthouse, Michael was quiet, lost in thought. He had escaped more serious consequences, but the lesson he had learned would stay with him for a long time. He had never understood before how deeply people could feel about their traditions and symbols. Now he realized that respect was not something to be taken lightly. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the deeper meaning behind those rules and the consequences of ignoring them. I hope this version continues to build the tension and keeps the story engaging. Let me know if you'd like any further changes. Jake sat in the small jail cell, staring at the cold walls around him. He had never imagined that his dream trip to London would end like this. The food was terrible, the bed was hard, and worst of all, he had no phone, no social media, no videos, no followers, just silence and regret. He thought about his life before this moment, how he had spent years chasing internet fame, always trying to be funnier, crazier, and more shocking. Now, all of that seemed pointless. After a few days, an officer came to his cell and told him it was time to leave. For a moment, Jake felt relief, but when he stepped outside, he saw two serious-looking officials waiting for him. They handed him a document. "You are officially banned from the United Kingdom," one of them said. "You must leave immediately, and you will not be allowed to return." Jake's stomach dropped. This was worse than he had expected. He had always wanted to travel the world, but now one of the most famous countries was forever closed to him. As he was escorted to the airport, people whispered and pointed at him. Some even took pictures. He knew exactly what they were doing, recording him, just like he used to record others. Now, he was the joke. At the airport, he was given his passport back and put on a flight home. The entire plane ride, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had thrown coffee at the Royal Guard, thinking it was just a joke, but the reality was different. That guard was a real person doing an important job. He had probably trained for years, standing there with pride and discipline. And Jake had disrespected that. It wasn't funny. It was just wrong. When he landed back home, his troubles weren't over. As soon as he turned on his phone, hundreds of notifications flooded in. News articles had been written about him. Videos of his arrest were everywhere. His social media accounts were filled with angry comments. "You deserve it." Some people wrote, "What were you thinking?" Others asked. His followers were leaving. His sponsors had canceled deals, and his reputation was in ruins. Jake wanted to defend himself, to explain that he never meant to hurt anyone, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had done this to himself. He had let his need for attention push him too far. He had ignored common sense, kindness, and respect, and now he was paying the price. In the weeks that followed, Jake tried to rebuild his life. He stopped making prank videos. Instead, he started learning about different cultures, respect, and responsibility. He stayed offline for a while, taking time to think about what kind of person he really wanted to be. One day, he got a message from an old friend. "Hope you learned your lesson," it said. Jake sighed and replied, "Yeah, I really did."